platform address is titled Living in the Anthropocene, Looking at Our Global Climate Emergency Through a Psychological Lens with Dr. Susan Spieler. Susan is a clinical psychologist, psychoanalyst who has been providing psychotherapy to adults and adolescents in Manhattan, as well as training mental health professionals for the past 38 years at several graduate and postgraduate programs in both New York City and New Jersey. During the last 10 years, her work has increasingly focused on how our global climate emergency is impacting people and how we can support one another. She is a member of the New York City Resilience and Emotional Support Team, also known as REST, through which she provided mental health services for traumatized evacuees after Superstorm Sandy in 2014. She has been part of the climate activist community in New York City for the past 10 years, and she has presented papers about our global climate emergency at international psychoanalytic conferences. She is on the board of Climate Psychology US and is currently exploring how to support Extinction Rebellion. Please welcome Dr. Susan Spieler.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And thank you, Monica, for inviting me today to give this talk. I'm going to talk about how to think about mental health in individuals and communities as we become increasingly aware of our global climate emergency. The existential threat that comes with acknowledging the global climate emergency is overwhelming. It causes many people to shut down and withdraw. While this is understandable, it is not a healthy response. I will suggest that by engaging with the issue within a diverse, supportive community, we can find healthy ways to live in our changing world. A year has passed since October, when the International Panel on Climate Change issued a report that said that we had 12 years before climate change will be irreversible. How many of you have heard about that before? Okay, so just little diagnostics on how much people know about what's going on. Welcome both those who haven't heard of it and those who have. Thank you. The findings of that report can help us understand why Greta Thunberg's recent talk at the UN Climate Summit was so passionate. In case some of you haven't seen the recording of her short talk to global leaders, I'll show it to you now. Can somebody please operate the machine? Thank you. So this is a short video, and then I'll continue talking.
Your first climate strike was a lonely event a little over a year ago, and in the intervening time, you have sparked the interest of millions, literally, of children around the globe, demanding action for climate change. What's your message to world leaders today?
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you are doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. want to believe that, because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now, is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming whether you like it or not. Thank you.
She has been so successful in mobilizing millions of people, children, adolescents, and adults all over the world. I'm so grateful to her. Greta's popularity stems largely from her ability to articulate the strong feelings that many of us hesitate to express. The rage she expressed to world leaders on September 23rd at the UN Climate Summit spoke for many of us. Remarkably, this 16-year-old has understood for several years that the clock is ticking and her generation will inherit devastating consequences of the fossil fuel consumption of previous generations. She calls attention to this injustice that there is no time for small talk. I agree with her. There is no time for small talk. Patience is not what we need now. The impatience that the global youth strikers that she founded has been expressing the nonviolent civil disobedience of Extinction Rebellion, and the nonviolent civil disobedience of Extinction Rebellion are necessary, healthy, and utterly appropriate. Some people feel like if you're angry, that's unhealthy, but there are reasons to be angry. And they're very strong reasons. They are articulating what is true and needed, World leaders must take swift action to reverse carbon emissions on the grand scale, and the media must represent the strong voices of millions of people globally by telling the truth about the urgency of the climate crisis. Thanks to the boldness and vision of Greta and of Extinction Rebellion, and to the last several years when Bill McKibben and 350.org laid the groundwork, the activist movement has been escalating rapidly. When we don't find outlets for our strong feelings, we tend to become depressed or experience free-floating anxiety. Here's the psychology part, okay. Many people who feel despondent about our global climate emergency haven't found their voices. Some seem to be going through a phase similar to the period when Greta, who has Asperger's, has been diagnosed with Asperger's. I don't know if everybody knows that. When she was depressed and mute, she went through a period where she wasn't talking at all as a child. After she learned about the climate crisis, she was silent. And many who feel paralyzing anxiety about forecasts by climate scientists haven't yet found ways to take constructive action. Nonviolent climate activism is actually good for the mental health of people who have shut down in response to our global climate emergency. There are many paths to act constructively and express ourselves. Finding one or more can help us feel that we have done what we can for the people who live after us. I first learned about climate change in 2009 when my daughter was writing a research paper in high school about climate change. When she shared what she was learning about it with me, I understood that this would affect her generation. I was determined to do something about it when she left for college. I found my way to this building where there were a lot of activist groups doing things and planning things about climate change. And I joined the New York City Grassroots Alliance because of their savvy, their knowledge, their determination, and collaborative spirit. Their mission was to ban fracking in New York State. Since then, I have gone on marches and demonstrations in New York City, Albany, and Washington, D.C. to stop fossil fuel proliferation and block the Keystone Pipeline, and I have testified at public hearings about the psychological impacts of climate change. After the Grassroots Alliance managed to achieve our goal of getting fracking banned in New York State, which was a big deal, I began hosting monthly events, educational events about the climate issue with films, speakers, and panels. Since then, I have been applying my 38 years of experience as a psychologist and psychoanalyst to the climate crisis. More recently, I have presented papers at 3 international psychoanalytic conferences about mental health impacts of our global climate emergency, and I have created and hosted a day-long program for mental health professionals about climate psychology, because my colleagues aren't as engaged as I would like them to be, doing things about that too. Being engaged in these ways has helped me remain sane during this period that many scientists refer to as the Anthropocene. They call it the Anthropocene to highlight that humans are responsible for the current mass extinction that is underway. For those of us who haven't developed constructive outlets for anxiety and our anger, now is a good time to find them. There are 2 reasons I'll suggest. One is that right now we're not currently experiencing a major storm or flood or crisis, so there is an opportunity to develop them now. And 2, there are many more ways to get involved. If you aren't sure how to get involved, feel free to contact me after the program, or you can ask Monica how to reach me, it's fine. Social scientists are predicting social breakdown as our global climate emergency intensifies. How many of you heard of that, social breakdown? As more people develop constructive outlets, it will be more possible to reduce potential conflict. This will help reduce the chaos that extreme weather events, droughts, and wildfires create. We all have seen news about the disorder and chaos that has resulted from massive hurricanes such as Maria in Puerto Rico, Harvey in Texas, and Dorian in the Bahamas. Some New Yorkers who were badly impacted by Superstorm Sandy in 2012 are still not back in their homes, and others are dealing with mold problems. Others have been fortunate to have escaped those experiences, but there is no guarantee that our reprieve will last. If communities don't find ways to manage their tension constructively, there is a greater risk of authoritarian personalities. There may be a rise in authoritarian leadership. We don't want that. I assume you agree. But they step in when there's chaos, so that's something to keep in mind. One constructive development that has potential to help people reduce their distress is Buddhist Extinction Rebellion. Buddhists are pacifists who care about the environment, and Extinction Rebellion is bold and outspoken. It sounds like a great combination to me, and Buddhist meditation is a tool that can enable you to manage your distress. If Buddhism isn't your cup of tea, there are lots of other ways to get involved. I witnessed some social breakdown in 2012 on a smaller scale when I was deployed by New York City's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to offer psychological first aid at a temporary shelter a few days after Superstorm Sandy in New York City. It was my first direct exposure to mental health impacts of the climate crisis. I will describe some of what I experienced there to make you understand what I'm saying clearer. I'm a member of a cadre of volunteer mental health professionals who are vetted by New York City Department of Health. We are called upon when there are disasters in New York City. I chose to report to a large public school building in Midtown West on Saturday afternoon, November 10th, 12 days after Superstorm Sandy had made landfall in New York City, which was on October 29th. City staff had transformed the building into a temporary shelter, and hundreds of cots and blankets, food, clothing, toys, and books were put on tables for the weekend when the school was not in session. When I arrived, there were many distressed people wandering around in the lobby. My first reaction on hearing their angry voices was that violence might break out. I later learned that some had been homeless before the storm and others had evacuated because of the storm. In retrospect, it is easy to understand their desperation. They needed a roof over their heads and food to eat, but they weren't certain that they would be allowed to enter the shelter. Soon, a team of uniformed police officers arrived and were dispersed throughout the building. Their presence seemed to have a calming effect. I believe it conveyed that there was a functional structure at the shelter, in contrast with the alarming chaos that many of the evacuees had experienced outside for several days with nowhere to go. We're lucky if we weren't in that position, right? I signed in and was directed to the space that was designated as the Health and Mental Health Center. I introduced myself to the person in charge from the health department. He was expecting me, so I realized that there was more order than had appeared when I first walked into the building. 2 volunteers were attending to 2 evacuees. One was administering acupuncture and the other was giving a massage. I understood that those who volunteered had been vetted and had been using their skills to calm traumatized people. It was a very traumatizing storm. You remember it probably watching it on television. It was scary just watching it on television, right? After a while, I asked the man from the health department how I could be of help. He looked in a logbook and asked me to speak with a 15-year-old Latina named Maria who was depressed. At first, I wondered how I would find her amidst all the people and the appearance of disorder, but he assured me that she was on the second floor and that someone at the head of the stairs would direct me to her. I found Maria and her younger sister sitting on cots with their bundles in a large open space with many rows of strangers on rows of cots. I wondered where their mother was. And when I met her a few hours later, she was sobbing in the distance, there were 2 female police officers sitting at desks. Maria explained that in mid-October, their family had been evicted from their apartment in the Bronx when their single mother had lost her job as a supermarket clerk. The city had offered them space in a homeless facility actually it was a homeless family shelter. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but there are family shelters for homeless people. So children live in them with their parents, if they have parents. With no other options, the mother accepted the space in Chinatown, and the girls transferred to new schools a month after they had started school in the Bronx. Prior to Sandy, this family had been abruptly uprooted from their Bronx community. Then they experienced traumatizing flooding from Sandy, which was compounded by having to evacuate from the Chinatown homeless family shelter, and then to the temporary shelter where I met them. That's a lot of disruption, right? It took me a long time to piece it all together. It was like even confusing for me when she was telling me about it. It was unbelievable, I thought. When I asked Maria how I could be of help, she asked me what to tell the girls in her new school about why she hadn't started school at the start of the school year. She was ashamed of her eviction story, and that there was they were living now in a homeless shelter for families. They didn't want to tell them. They didn't want to tell their peers. She also asked if I could find out where they would be going the next day. And it was at that moment that I realized that the temporary shelter we were standing around in would close the next day, so the building could resume functioning as a school on Monday. All of the evacuees that had sheltered there would have to leave the next day. I asked city employees who were working on solving these problems where Maria's family would be sent next, but they weren't able to tell me before I left at the end of my 12-hour shift. New York City didn't have ongoing space to house all the evacuees from the storm, and I doubt that we do now for future catastrophes. So that's really scary to think about, right? Like, where will people go who don't have a place to go in a storm in New York? There's not empty space sitting around waiting for them. Because of what they had experienced with her mother, and her mother lost her job, I thought that Maria and her mother better understood their precarious and uncertain circumstances than I did. They had lived through it. I hadn't. I would like to believe that homeless families were prioritized and that this family was given temporary housing until the damage to their Chinatown shelter was repaired. It was clear that they needed stability. After saying goodnight to them, I returned to the mental health and health space, updated the Department of Health person, and waited for my next assignment. It didn't take long. Shortly, I heard screaming from a woman nearby. I and another mental health professional found her sitting on a cot amidst many other people. She pointed to a man across the room and said she didn't feel safe because he was looking at her weirdly. We didn't know what to do about that in the limited time that we had to be there. So we offered to move her to the second floor where there was an available cot near the 2 female police officers who were sitting at the desks. That seemed to be comforting to her. To me, that was not much of an intervention, but that's what happens in an emergency. You just do concrete things. There are no available statistics about the mental health impacts from Superstorm Sandy. I later learned that New York City did not follow up with the people who had gone to these shelters or offered them more mental health services. I suspect that that's because there was no funding for ongoing mental health services despite the psychological trauma that these people had endured. I imagine that this was not a priority for the city, though I know that the unhealed trauma doesn't go away without help. It just sits below the surface and gets triggered the next time there's something traumatic. I still wonder what happened to Maria and her family and how they're doing. I think about them. It's been a long time. I don't think about them all the time, but I bring them up to people when I have an opportunity. My experience as a psychologist has taught me that people who experience as much disruption as they did are likely to be burdened with insecurity, psychological trauma, and shame. Maria will need help overcoming these feelings, but may never receive it. Without data, it is as if none of what I witnessed really happened. You can't prove that I did this, but I think it sounds pretty legitimate, right? Even if I couldn't do much to help the evacuees, this story can teach us about the mental health impacts of climate change. It provides a window into the chaos that climate evacuees and refugees experience when they're unable to protect themselves in the face of our global climate emergency and the limited resources that exist to address them. 6 years later, I attended a conference where I learned about a mountain community in Puerto Rico called Mariana, not to be confused with Maria, Mariana, which had been devastated by Hurricane Maria, a little confusing, in 2017. 2 of the speakers at the conference, Christina and Luis, had emerged as community leaders in the recovery of Mariana. They realized that they couldn't wait for help from FEMA. Their neighbors were starting to eat rotting food. So Christina opened a kitchen, and their neighbors volunteered to do the cooking, and farmers and gardeners found produce for them to cook. When Luis recruited laborers and construction workers, he organized a group to build a laundry facility, and he created another group to find solar panels to make it work. And they succeeded at this. Because this community had lost so much, few had money to pay for the food and for the use of the laundry facility, so those who wanted these essential resources were expected to donate their labor and their time. After losing almost everything, this community worked together and survived by sharing their skills and collaboration. And that working as a community felt therapeutic. They realized that staying home was not making them feel good. They liked coming to this place. This and the initiatives of Christina and Luis brought them together and made them less dependent on FEMA. Mariana became a model of a psychosocial, resilient community. Those of us who haven't experienced devastating loss and trauma are extremely fortunate, but no one is immune in the Anthropocene. The race and socioeconomic factors often determine how vulnerable we are as we face our global climate emergency. We Act is another community that exemplifies psychosocial resilience. I'm going to talk about it now. And I'm happy that we have a guest. Charles Calloway is just raise your hand to Charles. He's the outreach coordinator at We Act, and that's his wife. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I became a supporter of We Act for Environmental Justice, which is an impressive nonprofit organization located in West Harlem, after hearing a talk about environmental justice by Cecil Corbin Marks, who is their deputy director. I learned from him that poor people of color tend to experience more environmental pollution and asthma than affluent white people. This is not a coincidence, it's a form of racism. When New York City government has to decide where to build a new depot for diesel-operated buses, for example, they're inclined to put them in West Harlem or in another poor black neighborhood. We Act helps their constituents advocate for themselves as a group and use that power to influence politics, including rejecting projects that will harm their community. We Act has developed relationships with their elected officials who can influence their environment in West Harlem. Recently, Dan Zarelli, who is Senior Director of Climate Policy and Programs in the Mayor's Office, was a guest speaker at one of their events, which I thought was very impressive. He doesn't just give talks everywhere, this guy, he's busy. People of color in the United States have experienced many generations of injustice. This tends to make them feel helpless and depressed. A common result is that they are unconsciously silencing themselves. When people silence themselves, they don't advocate for themselves, and this perpetuates injustice. This is why the work of We Act is so important. Constituents of We Act are learning to advocate for themselves. It makes me very happy when I'm able to go to some of their meetings to see that. We Act is an increasingly psychosocial resilience community. And I'm mentioning these two communities, the one in Puerto Rico and this one in New York, because we need more resilient communities to prepare for future crises. So this is probably a pretty resilient community too, but I think it's a good idea for all communities to meet together and think ahead of what's coming in terms of increasing climate change and plan for it. As we have seen, Greta Thunberg was mute and depressed when she was a child. In that way, she too silenced herself until she began to find her voice. With her voice, she has mobilized millions of people to do so too. So that's pretty amazing, 16-year-old girl. It turns out we were all silenced by a collusion between the fossil fuel industry and the politicians that they support. This is sound evidence that there is sound evidence that Exxon knew 42 years ago that they were doing harm to our environment. 42 years ago they were doing this, and they covered it up. And when Dr. James Hansen, who's a climate scientist and was a NASA director, testified before Senate committees 31 years ago about the certainty that global warming was caused by burning fossil fuels, President George Bush, who was his boss, silenced him. It's really, I didn't believe it myself, but I went through the newspapers and the archives in the New York Times, and you can find this information yourself, because it's really hard to believe, it's shocking. But so these two situations were telling us what's happening now, and we could have done so much more if we started earlier. We're waking up and uncovering the lies about our global climate emergency. We have good reasons to be angry, but if we're to express our anger constructively, we must do it non-violently, with love, paradoxically, with love in our hearts. That may sound impossible, but the leading phrase that's being used by Extinction Rebellion is love and rage. Makes sense. That's one of their phrases that they're using now. My story is about the temporary shelter in New York City and the mountain town in Puerto Rico illustrates some of the ways that the climate crisis impact mental health. There is no simple lesson to take away from these stories other than the fact that we're all vulnerable in our warming world. The financially vulnerable evacuees who went to the temporary shelter after Sandy were traumatized, insecure, ashamed, and dependent on New York City with nowhere to go, and New York City couldn't promise to house all of them after the weekend, and we don't know how they're faring. So think about it, like people get traumatized, they don't get healed, next storm comes, what happens? They're re-traumatized. And when we don't have places for people to stay, there's chaos, and chaos breeds vulnerability to authoritarian leaders. So, U.S. is second only to China in contributing to carbon emissions, but the U.S. has contributed so much to because the U.S. has contributed so much to the warming, we are responsible for the climate destruction, drought, and starvation that poorer countries have been experiencing. Though most of us were unaware of our consumption of fossil fuels was harming our other countries, we should demand that our country acknowledges our responsibility and do what we can to make reparation to those we have harmed. So I'm going to end my talk in a few minutes by reading a few excerpts from a very recent article by Jonathan Franzen, who this was published in the New Yorker on September 8th. It's called, "What If We Stop Pretending the Apocalypse is Coming? To prepare for it, we have to admit that we can't prevent it." What has inspired me to read some of this is that he focuses on ethics, and here we are at Ethical Culture, so I thought it was appropriate. And if you want to read it, just look on the internet for that issue, the September 8th issue, to read the whole article. Here are a couple of things he says. Even if we can no longer hope to be saved from 2 degrees of warming, there is still a strong practical and ethical case for reducing carbon emissions. In the shorter term, half measures are better than no measures. Halfway cutting our emissions would make the immediate effects of warming somewhat less severe, and it would somewhat postpone the point of no return. If collective action resulted in just one fewer devastating hurricane, just a few extra years of relative stability, it would be a goal worth pursuing. So he's trying to tell people, if you feel hopeless, there are reasons to stay engaged. And I like that about this article. Here are some other things that he said. In times of increasing chaos, people seek protection in tribalism and armed force rather than the rule of law. And our best defense against this kind of dystopia is to maintain functioning democracies, functioning legal systems, functioning communities. That's where Ethical Culture, you have an opportunity to hang together and build your community. In this respect, any movement toward a more just and civil society can now be considered a meaningful climate action. Securing fair elections is a climate action. Combating extreme wealth inequality is a climate action. I can go on and say more, but I'm going to wrap up. To survive rising temperatures, every system, whether of the natural world or the human world, will need to be as strong and healthy as we can make it. So don't think there's nothing you can do. There's plenty. Thank you.